Hello, my friends. I'm so excited to be here with you again for yet another Tea and Jam with me, my ongoing public research project, which is supporting my work for the I'm a Little Teapot project. Today, I'm going to be in conversation with Andrea Assaf, who I have known for about 20 years now through alternate routes. And we spent a year, 1 week holed up here in Atlanta during Hurricane Irma. Andrea is a poet, a playwright, a theater maker par excellence, and an activist. And she has so many irons in the fire right now. I'm so excited to get her to talk about all of the amazing projects that she is building and recreating. Andrea, are you there? Hello.
Hello.
How are you? And are you drinking tea today?
I am. I always love a cup of tea with a Zoom conversations and love to be on Tea and Jam with me with you.
Oh, well, tell us about your tea before we get started.
It's a turmeric ginger tea and it's in a cup that says from the land of olives and resistance for Palestine.
Palestine for
Yes.
Palestine. Yes, I'm drinking my cold brew decaf because it's very hot in Atlanta today. I can't
Yes.
explain about the heat to someone that's even further south, though.
Yes. You're in Tampa, Florida, the land of Seminole and Tocobaga peoples. It is very hot in that swamp out there.
Yes. Tell me you have an actual literal alligator who lives in is your neighbor.
Yes, actually, through those woods, we have a neighbor that has a retention pond, and there is a resident alligator. I like to get out the binoculars and try to see him every now and then.
Just as long as he stays far enough away that you
Yeah.
need that for
No,
it.
look, see, I have props, but I actually have binoculars for looking for wildlife,
Yes,
which I enjoy doing.
better than a drone, which
Yes,
is one of the names of the project that you're working on. So
yes,
should I dive
indeed.
right into talking about drone?
Sure, whatever you want.
Let's talk about your latest project. I want to hear all about it.
Yeah. Shannon, I think you've probably had this experience that some projects happen very quickly and like go from idea to creation and production and maybe tour, and that might be a couple years, like 2 years. This project, this project is forever. The drone project started as an idea in, I think, 2009. And the first like exploration was in collaboration with Art Spot Productions and Mondo Bizarro. I know you recently had Nick Sly on your in your conversations in New Orleans, and that I think was 2012, 2013. And so this project has been ideating for a very long time, and then a lot of research, a lot of writing, and we're finally in the stage where we've been in the last couple of years creating a music score. I have like a full length script, which I think is draft 6 and probably not the last draft for sure. And it's still in development. So, but the Drone project, Drone is a play, but it's also a transmedia project, highly multimedia, and also a whole process of having dialogues or instigating dialogues about drone warfare and US military policy. And the play, in which Nick Sly plays the drone pilot, yes, follows a pilot who gets a job with as a military contractor flying drones, and moves from Tennessee to Las Vegas, Nevada. Outside of Las Vegas is Creech Air Force Base, which is the biggest drone pilot training base in the country, in the US. And so he moves his family out to Nevada and begins this new job. And the play is about what that job does to him and his family. But concurrent, or parallel to that story is we meet three characters called the survivors, and the survivors are three Muslim women whose text is all based on actual testimonies of witnesses and survivors of U.S. drone strikes in primarily Yemen, Somalia, and Afghanistan. And I read all those testimonies that I could find and then rewrote them into poetry. So there's like a 3-person multi-voice poetry where they kind of always appear together, kind of like a chorus in the classical sense. So yeah, and it's a big, ambitious, huge project.
Okay, so from a process perspective, tell me what it's like to hold the vision and the vessel for a project like that for so long. I mean, it must, do your muscles feel tired from that kind of exertion? Or is it something that you've been able to put down and come back to, put down and come back to without worrying about it?
Well, I definitely had to put it down and come back to it. You know, funding is very difficult for a very politically charged piece like this that is critical of US military policy, right? And even though I try my best as a playwright to humanize everyone in the play, including the pilot, it's still a piece that takes on subjects that are rather taboo about, like, do we have the right to assassinate people by remote control, and who gets to make those decisions? And what role does the US play in the world, really, right? So sometimes I have to put it down for periods of time because I don't have the support or funding or infrastructure to continue it. And then, and sometimes I'm lucky and I do. It's also a huge ensemble. It's like at least 16-person ensemble, and that's with a lot of double casting. So, so it's, you know, it takes a lot of resources to gather everyone for creative work. But I actually, you know, this came up, we did some excerpts of work in progress for the Veteran Arts Triennial in March 2023 in Chicago, which was quite a honor and a challenge to be invited to perform excerpts of this piece for an audience that was mostly veterans. And we had an amazing dialogue after, but someone asked me a similar question about, like, how do we take care of ourselves doing this kind of work? And what I found myself saying to the audience was, you know, yes, it's really hard to say this text and to hold it, but I actually feel better when I say it, because when I'm walking around with it living in my head and I can't say it, that is much, much harder. So for me, being able to work on it has a kind of process and release that I do believe is healing. And I hope that there's some element of that experience for the audience as well, even though it's a hard text.
So I have no doubt that your characterization of the pilot is something that is humanizing and complex, because I've noticed about your work that you have the long view of connecting with veterans. You've been holding a veterans open mic in Tampa for a long time. So you started a long time ago with your project 11 Reflections of September. So war and the impact of war on us is a through line of your work.
Absolutely.
Can you talk about, like, where that comes from for you from a personal perspective?
Sure. I mean, it's unfortunately, it feels to me, I know not everybody feels this way, but for me, it feels kind of somewhat inescapable being Arab American in the 21st century. Like, but not just, also the 20th century. Like, I realized that, you know, I'm Lebanese American on my father's side. My grandfather was from Lebanon. And I grew up during the period of what is referred to as the Lebanese Civil War, although I understand it now as very much a proxy war about global geopolitics and not really just a civil war. But as I was a little kid in the 70s, 80s, I graduated high school in 1991, and that war ended in 1990-ish. So I remember being really young, like in elementary school, and I like being asked to draw a flag about your heritage, and I was trying to draw the cedar tree on the Lebanese flag, and the teacher says, "Oh, Lebanon, they're at war, right?" And so I think that being Arab American or being Lebanese American specifically, I've been aware of a thing called war for as long as I can remember, like my entire childhood, even though I lived a very, in some ways, privileged childhood, in terms of not being like personally touched by war. But the consciousness of it is not something that all children in the US have. And I can't remember a time when I didn't know about a thing called war, right? So I think that was always there. But then, of course, 9/11 like just changed my relationship to my identity, like for the rest of my life. I think you know this. I lived in New York City in 2001. And so I experienced 9/11 as both a New Yorker and an Arab American, which was a like deeply cognitively dissonant thing to live through. And and I was an emerging artist at that time. So that's what I started making work about. And I keep hoping there'll be a day, like Adrienne Rich says, where I can just write about trees, but that day hasn't come yet.
Yeah. I mean, I was there the night at the Roots, the legendary Roots late night when you dropped that poem, Roots, We Have to Talk About the War, where that I think was the birth of the 11 Reflections of September. Can you talk about that, the through line of that piece and how that came to be?
Yeah, that was definitely a key moment. I wrote this piece that actually, 11 Reflections on September originally was a series of poems that I was just writing from like 2001 to 2011. And I didn't have an opportunity to gather them into a project or a performance until I was able to be an artist in residence with Pangea World Theater in Minneapolis in 2010 to 2011 with support of a Princess Grace Award. And that's where the show 11 Reflections on September was really born, was at Pangea. But in 2006, that was the summer that Israel was bombing Beirut. And I remember I was at the time an advisor for Creative Capital, and I went to their like epic Creative Capital retreat, which used to be like something where it was really mind-blowing. Like you'd get to sit there for days and listen to artist after artist present 7 minutes about their work. And, after a few days, your mind was like, it was amazing and inspiring and in so many ways. And I felt like I was the only person thinking about the war, what was happening. So I'm like trying to be present there. And I just was in shock that like I was trying to be present there, and at the same time I'm getting emails from friends in Beirut who are going through the siege. I'm getting like requests from WBAI in New York to do a radio interview. I'm like this, that's my inbox, while everybody else's just gets to focus on art. Right. And so I wrote this piece called "When Are We Going to Talk About the War?" And that was that particular bombing was summer, was July. And so I think that I performed it probably for the first time at Roots in August. Yeah.
Do you, in terms of process, typically start a piece as poetry first and then turn it into theater?
That's a great question. It depends. So I feel like I do different, like very different kinds of process. One is like my personal private writing process that I think usually does start with poetry, or monologues. And you know, the Drone is like the biggest, the most I've ever written in a kind of narrative play with lots of characters kind of way. All my previous work is kind of more abstract and experimental in form. And this one I really set out to like write a contemporary tragedy, a play, in a conscious way. So yeah, so sometimes it does, that kind of work starts with me and writing, and then after writing for a long time, start to figure out what would this look like in space on stage with people and all the production elements. But then I also do devised work, which is totally different, which is like get in the room with a bunch of people and find out who they are and like play around and make stuff, which may or may not have a theme or a topic, and then, you know, see what we create. And sometimes that starts with the body or starts with story circles, actually, and dialogues, and then, you know, really comes from the group. In which case I'm more of a facilitator for a while and then become a dramaturg and then the director, which is what I'm about to go do in San Francisco, actually.
Okay, so because some of the words that you used and the concepts like devised theater and dramaturg, somebody that might be listening may not have access to that sort of language.
Yeah.
So talk about that process a little bit more and what you're going to be doing.
Yeah. This all related to the question you were asking about 11 Reflections. So that project, 11 Reflections on September, initially was a show that I toured for like, well, from like 2011 to 2016. And then at some point, I started feeling like my voice wasn't enough. Like I needed a lot more voices to talk about what it is to be Arab American or Middle Eastern in the United States in this, what I now think of as the post 9/11 era, right? This 20 plus year time period that we've been living in that has impacted so many things, from like the Patriot Act to immigration policy to surveillance to the militarization of police departments, of course, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I started feeling like I need a lot more people's voices in this work. And so I changed my whole approach to that project to make it no longer like a solo piece with music, which it was, and multimedia, not really solo, because I very much think of the music ensemble as collaborators in that work, but I was the only one doing text, right? So then I started saying like, okay, forget that. What if I went around the country and I invited a bunch of people in each city to tell their own stories about what life post 9/11 has been like for them, and in every city kind of use the structure of the original piece, which basically starts with 9/11 and ends with whatever is happening politically in the present moment, and some of that original raw material as like a way to instigate conversation and story and creation of new material. And so, so it's in San Francisco. So I did this first in San Antonio with the Carver Community Cultural Center in San Antonio, Texas, which is just an amazing organization to work with. If you don't know them and you're watching, check them out because the Carver is amazing. And so in San Francisco, I got to well, interestingly, an artist who was following the San Antonio project online because we had to do a lot virtually during the pandemic. Choreographer Pearl Ubungan got excited about the San Antonio work and was like, we should do this in the San Francisco Bay Area, and got me a meeting with Brava for Women in the Arts. And started talking with Brava, and then Brava was like, we should have some other co-producers. And of course, if you don't know, the longest running Middle Eastern theater company in the country is in San Francisco. That's Golden Thread Productions, and amazing organization as well. And so they came on as a producing partner. And in May, really, of this year, we started finding ensemble members and doing community dialogues and putting the word out. So now I have this incredible ensemble of Bay Area artists that I got to start creating with in July. And so devising means like we get together in a studio. I like we do like story circles or theater games or movement exercises, ensemble building. And then we start to tell stories and write and create a new piece together. So like I got to go in July, I got to go to a board appreciation dinner with Golden Thread, and the board members were like, oh, tell us about this show. And I'm like, I will once I create it. There will definitely be a show. And we have dates in a theater, so come see what we make. Because it's still very much in process. So but in this time, of course, in the structure of starting with 9/11 and going up to the present moment, we have a commitment to talk about Palestine and a number of Palestinian artists, both in the music ensemble and the acting ensemble. And so we are, in the throes of creating, and we'll see what we make.
So my mind just went in two directions because I feel like, given that I'm sitting here a stone's throw from Cop City, would really important to bring you here to Atlanta. Like, I think we should bring you here to do like a double header of both that devised version of 11 reflections as well as drone. So I'll just put that out there into the universe. Like, we need to make that happen.
Yes.
But this also, with where you're leading a little bit with the conversation, I imagine that with everything that's happened since October 7th, it's like there's a whole new lens to your work.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that I've been talking about this. We did a timeline exercise with the ensemble, kind of exploring what are key like memories of like what was happening in the world and what was happening with us at different times, and where people in the ensemble, where we were at that time, and what we remember about these key historical moments. And so of course, like everybody remembers where they were on 9/11. But then it's interesting that not everybody remembered where they were when George W. Bush declared war on Afghanistan, except for the Afghan artist in the ensemble. That's a really important conversation, right? So, and similarly with Palestine, like sometimes key moments in the history of Palestine were not shared knowledge in the group. And so that's been a really interesting exploration about how we remember and who remembers what and how we commemorate and who gets to tell that story, right? And in this particular moment, we have the reason I brought up the timeline exercise is one of the things that I was talking about in that moment was like the Iraq War, specifically the Iraq War, was the first time that human beings watched a war live on television.
Right.
Right?
You mean the first one in 91?
Actually, 2003. I mean, I think in 91 we were still getting, I'm not sure if we were getting live coverage or like, filmed,
Yeah.
but actually live, right? Although I should double check that if it was live in 91, but definitely the Iraq, the US invasions of Iraq.
Right.
But this is the first time. This genocide in Gaza is the first time that human beings have watched a genocide live streamed on their telephones. Right. I wish I could say it's the last time, but I'm pretty sure it's not going to be. And so really thinking about the relationship to war, to technology and war, and what it means to carry it around, literally.
Right.
Right. And so that is weighing so heavily on everyone. And then it becomes really important, like, okay, so we're all getting together to make this work. And some of the ensemble members have family in Palestine right now, or have family trying to get to the States from Palestine. And how do we, hold the relentless reality of what's happening and still and hold each other through that in a creative process and still find healing and joy in that process, and still embrace the idea that joy is a form of resistance, or that being able to be together and to speak on a stage like Brava is a form of resistance, so it's like it's all the things all at once. And I think to your question is like, I'm sure there is so much about what's happening in Gaza that we don't know yet, that we won't know until human rights workers are able to be there and journalists are able to safely be there, and there's forensics, and we don't even know yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You gave our one of our keynotes, we call them pollinators at Roots. I think it was the last Roots that we had in person before the pandemic. And I was so struck by the point that you brought up about how in popular culture, there's so much from our growing up time. You and I are very much contemporaries, we're close in age. From the use of Middle Eastern folks as the villain, and how that's played into the way that we're able to just do what we're able to do on the national stage and the international stage. Do you see ways that continues to, like, pop culture is being used and wielded in that way, or is it changing? Like, do you have reflections on that? Do you feel is that something that factors into your work as a culture maker? Can you just like sort of riff on that for a minute?
Yeah, I absolutely think it continues. There are certainly wonderful examples of how it is changing and that pattern's being broken. I just started watching a series last night that I've been hearing about called We Are Lady Parts. I don't
I
know
love
if
that show. Oh my God, I
I
love that
know.
show so
It's
much.
so fun. And, so there are definitely like projects, even uh, even the way that like certain artists are kind of breaking into mainstream like Hollywood films in roles that aren't terrorists, right? Um, like Remy playing Freddie Mercury and stuff like that. Those are definitely things to celebrate. But I think that overall, mainstream, the keynote that you were talking about, I was looking at the film, which I think everybody should look at. It's a documentary called Real Bad Arabs, REEL, and it looks at it's Jack Shaheen's research on 100 years of Hollywood representation, and how in 100 years there's like not even 10% of representations are in any way good of Middle Eastern people. And so even though there are strides being made in popular media, and this is a conversation very alive in the theater community, by the way. Like there are a whole lot of, especially younger theater artists who are Middle Eastern American who are like, I don't want to write tragedy. I want to write a rom-com, or I want to, I want to write about like my vagina and getting married. And I'm like, that's great. I'm so glad. You should totally write about that. And also, I can't stop thinking about war. So that's
Right.
where I am. But it's wonderful that there's this like pushback about like we should get to be able to tell any kind of story, like any kind of American, right? But I think if you realistically look at the media at large, in especially news media, it's still extremely biased and in how it represents Arabs and people of the Middle East and Muslims in general. And of course, I always refer people, if you're not familiar with Edward Said's work on Orientalism, he writes very in depth about how it's essentially like it's the repetition of it through a lifetime that creates a dehumanization that is very, very difficult to counter.
So I'm curious, you mentioned that when you were in New York in the early 2000s, you were at that time an emerging artist. And because we're contemporaries, that would have meant you were in your middle, late 20s.
Yeah.
Um, have you always identified as an artist? Did you go through like scrapping phase like my show is about? Like,
Oh yeah.
yeah, okay. Because
Oh yeah,
I'm
very scrappy. Yeah.
like exploring about this notion of like we build our sense of identity through work. Some of us do, others do not, which is always like I'm fascinated when I have like especially when I go home and have conversations with some of my distant family members around the table at Christmas. I'm like, oh, how's your job? And they just like get this blank stare and they're like, it's just a job, and I'm like, so different,
Yeah.
so but I'm curious, tell us about your early life and how it led to this career as an artist.
Yeah, it's a mystery, isn't it? Like why we become artists. I remember being like a freshman in college, and one of the faculty in orientation being like, if you can go do anything else with your life, go do it, because this road is very scrappy and long. Um, but I didn't really grow up in a family of artists. I had like my mother, her whole life has kind of sometimes written poetry, but that's always been very personal to her. She was a stockbroker by profession. And most of the other people in my family were like business people or scientists. Yeah, no other, and I grew up early years in the DC area and then later in Pennsylvania, rural Pennsylvania. So I had no idea what I was doing. Like, I don't know why. I got drawn to theater. I fell in love with it. And I feel like I think I was always writing. I was always writing poetry since I was young, but didn't know what to do with it, right? And so I fell in love with theater in high school at a community theater because my high school didn't really have a theater program. So I wound up helping kind of make like a drama club, and I got involved in competing with Shakespeare and stuff like that. And then, auditioned and got into NYU and decided to move to New York at the age of 18. So that's,
18. You were only 18 when you moved to New York?
yeah, yeah, like right out of high school. Went to NYU and then stayed for like 12 years.
Oh, God. Did you wait tables?
No, never waited tables. I managed not to.
So did you ever have like a shitty job? Like what was like the worst job you ever had?
I think I have like no patience and little tolerance, so I never lasted long in a shitty job. But I like literally like maybe I'd last a week or something in catering, or like catering at a convention center, or
Hard job.
or cold calling, like phone banking, like horrible stuff like that. But I was very lucky because I started teaching very young. I was a TA for what at that time was the brand new Meisner studio at NYU, because my teacher that I worked with both in school and outside of school independently was a Meisner teacher. And I worked with her for 5 years. And so then when she had the opportunity to open a Meisner studio at NYU, I got a job as a teaching assistant. I was still an undergrad, which is crazy, right? So I started teaching really young, and luckily have been able to like make a way piecing together teaching and consulting, and then of course I was pretty young when I got to work with Animating Democracy, the Animating Democracy Initiative, with Barbara Schaefer Bacon and Pam Corza, who were incredible mentors. And I was very, very lucky to get that position at a young age, which was kind of that and Roots, I would say, were my like entryway into the field, into understanding on a national scale what the field was beyond New York City,
Mhm. That's great. So I don't know if you remember, but the Teapot Project has 4 tenets: passion,
Ah,
purpose, possibility, and power.
yes.
I've played around with having some other things like permission, potential, well, that's very close to possibility, play, but these 4 have sort of stuck, and it's easier to remember for. Um, I'm curious, well, first of all, what do you think about these tenets? Like, do they spark joy for you? Do you have thoughts about
I actually love them. I think it's a great collection. It's again, passion, power, purpose, and
possibility?
possibility. Yes. It's a really great collection of
Cool.
words. Yeah.
Um, so usually at this time, I either ask somebody to tell me a story about one of those 4 words, or I have a random number generator, and you can let me pick a number for you.
Ooh, let's do
Either
that.
one. You want to do that? Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
yeah, that sounds fun.
Okay.
Because I'll end up answering all 4 of them, and that'll be a mess. Yeah. Pick one. Oh,
Okay.
how cool. Yeah.
Okay, tell me when to stop.
Oh, stop.
13. All right. Would you please tell us a story about yourself at the age of 13?
Oh, see, I thought the number generator was going to pick one of the 4. Oh, at the age of 13. Oh my gosh. That's such an awkward, horrible age.
Uh, I, I
Is
would
that
hope,
middle school?
yeah,
Yeah,
8th, 7th,
middle
8th.
school's the worst, the absolute worst.
Yeah.
Um, However, I think that's about the time that, and this is strangely relevant to my theater life. Um, gosh, I can't remember exactly how old I was when I started training, but when I was around that age, I started training in Shotokan karate. And it was because, yes, and it was because my older sister, Dawn, was started training. She was in college already. And she got very involved. And I was always really grateful that she found karate, because I remember there was a time when she was like talking to an army recruiter and thinking about military service. And I think a lot of people who are drawn to that really are, what they're really looking for is like training and structure, right? And she found Shotokan and instead was like, no, I'm gonna do this. But you know, I looked up to my older sister and I was like the annoying younger sister who like wanted to do whatever she was doing. So I started training too. And we were like this funny sister duo in karate classes for many years. But I think it kind of got me through the awkward, horrible stage of middle school. And it also ironically got me to stop fighting, because I used to get in a lot of fights when I was a kid. And uh, that's partly because I wasn't processing home life things very well, but it's also partly because nobody looked like me in rural Pennsylvania. And I had moved, I was born in Virginia and lived in Maryland, DC, and said things like y'all and ate grits. And that made me an easy target in Pennsylvania, you know. And so anyway, I started training in karate and was being taught that it's a responsibility to have that knowledge, to have the knowledge of how to hurt someone is a responsibility, and you don't use it unless it's self-defense and you have no other choice. And so because I heard that lesson, I stopped getting in random fights. And and now as a performing artist, I am so grateful for that early training. I had to, by the time I got to high school, I had to choose. I was already a brown belt. And I got to the point where I could have tested for my black belt. And I had to choose, am I going to go deeper into this practice or do I want to do theater? And theater was calling me so strongly that I left karate for theater. However, that was my first real physical training.
Sure.
And I feel extremely grateful that at a very early age I learned about physical training. I learned about what it is to connect to your center and how to breathe and how to stand and how to focus your energy, how to follow directions, a whole lot of things that are very useful in theater life. Um, so I still feel that Shotokan is deeply in me somewhere and prepared me for a theater practice as an adult.
Miyagi-Do. Andrea, have you watched Cobra Kai?
No, I
Oh.
didn't.
Not that I have.
Oh, uh-huh.
Um, okay, so even though we're contemporaries age-wise, I'm starting over again. And I'm curious what your advice to me is for this new storytelling practice, and especially like not. I started my storytelling practice in 2016, but I spent a lot of time going all over helping other people tell their stories, and I'm really only just now getting started again telling my own stories. So what do you think I need to know as I'm like really starting my first full-length show?
Um, I think most important thing is to really listen to your own voice and trust that you know a whole lot about storytelling and how to structure and make a good story. You know more than most people I know about that. And I know that it's might feel like a leap translating it to theater or solo work or solo performance in a long form. But everyone will have an opinion, and the most important opinion is your own. Is to really know your voice and listen to your gut and make your own work. And when people give you input or feedback, you ultimately decide what is right for you and what is you'll know if you really tune into that voice, right? Because outside opinions can pull your work in so many different directions, and you have to know when to hold your own and when to, oh, I do need to explore over here, and maybe I need to explore over here. But then you gotta be able to come back to center and really listen to you and what you're trying to say.
That's the thing though. That's the hardest thing. That's you know, I spent a year in a directing program and flamed out and turned into an arts administrator because I couldn't hold that sense of self through being a director. So how do you build that muscle? How do you get that sense of, I know what my artistic vision is, and being able to execute it even with feedback?
I mean, a lot of it's experience. You got to let yourself try stuff and let it fail, and then let it, you got to try stuff and then be like, well, that was a hot mess. And then, but here's what I learned from it and what I want to do next time, and then do it. Right. And then, so experience is still the best teacher. I mean, there's so many things to be gained from training programs and methodologies and practices, and especially exchange with other directors. One of the things that I do in collaboration with Pangea World Theater is the National Institute for Directing and Ensemble Creation, which is a peer exchange model program. We don't try to teach one methodology. It's all about people getting in a room and learning from each other. So there's so much value in that. But really, like, to develop your own aesthetic, you just got to explore and find out. And sometimes I find, I really learned this, this is going to sound weird, but having my poetry translated into another language was one of the most like revealing things I've ever experienced, because first of all, there's so many things that are untranslatable. And so you wind up having to have deep conversations about what you actually mean with the translator so that they can figure out what's the equivalent phrasing in Spanish or in Polish. And for example, but the other thing that's interesting about it is, like, when someone else spends a chunk of time looking at a bunch of your work, they start to see like themes and recurrences that I myself didn't even know were there. But then once someone could help me see it, then I'd be like, oh, this is actually part of my aesthetic.
Yeah.
So like I couldn't even tell you what my aesthetic was in poetry until I heard other people talking about it to me or in front of me. And I was like, oh, am I doing that? I guess I do that. Oh, wow.
Yeah, I totally meant to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you're like, yeah, that's 100% I meant to do that. But so much of our aesthetic comes out of a not fully conscious or pre-articulated place.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or pre-verbal place even. that sometimes you have to make a bunch of stuff for a while before you can even see what the pattern is, you know? So that's why, especially if you're, for anyone out there who's like working on their first full length project or first full length solo show, it's like, yeah, don't put the kitchen sink in it, because this shouldn't be your, don't stop here. This isn't a one-shot deal. It's like, you know, hone in on what this thing is, and all those other ideas are like, oh, those might be 5 other projects.
Right.
And it might not be till I get to the 5th project that I can look back and go, oh, now I think I know what I'm doing. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
but you know so much about storytelling, Shannon. I feel like I learn from you all the time when I watch you as a storyteller. Truly.
Thank you, friend.
Yeah.
So I'm aware that people may be tuning in because of we've had some deep conversations about Palestine already, but I'm curious from an activist standpoint, there may be folks who haven't had a chance to hear directly from someone who is an activist and has, access to what it is that they feel like people should be doing, should be reading, should be listening to. Like, what do you think are the things that people should be paying attention to right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's so much in there. I think a lot of people have a whole lot to learn, and just have a whole lot of questions. And so the first thing is to do your homework and, do some real research and reading about not just this moment in time of what's happening in Gaza right now, but also the history of how we got here. From my point of view, which of course I believe is the truth, the state of Israel is a colonial. It was set up post World War II. I mean, this is oh gosh, there are so many like myths and stories that we have been told or tell ourselves in America, in the U.S. about World War II and how we're the good guys. We don't talk about that time when the US was actually funding and supporting Hitler. We don't talk about that time when the US didn't want Anne Frank's ship to arrive to US shores. We don't talk about like how part of the impetus of like the Allied powers to create a place called Israel was because they did not want to accept all those Jewish refugees. Right? So the evil is so deep in the creation of a state, of a national, a country, that was really driven by the Allied forces post World War II wanting an ally base in the Middle East at the moment of the rise of the oil industry, right? So they all funded and armed this group of extremists to go push people out of their land and, if necessary, kill them in order, those people who happen to be Palestinian in a land called Palestine, to create a new nation state that would be that ally for the US and Western European powers. So so when you understand the history of it, as it was always a colonizing impulse, then all of these individual wars and quote unquote conflicts have a frame of reference for understanding. It's not incidental that the people occupying the occupied territories call themselves settlers in the same way that early colonies in the US called themselves settlers, and with the same genocidal intent to take the land and the resources. So, you know, I look at everything through a post-colonial framework. And I think sometimes in the States, we just have all these conversations without any framework about, like, you know, that lead us to these, to statements like, why are these people so angry? Right? So I think that's the first thing. Do your homework. There are wonderful organizations that are led by Palestinians and Arab American and Middle Eastern arts leaders, for example, who that have made, not only made statements, but compiled resource lists that are really fabulous. I want to uplift the Arab American National Museum, MISNA, the Literary Journal. Both of those institutions are led by Palestinian American women. And Golden Thread Productions, in which I already mentioned, Noor Theater in New York City. Like, there are many organizations that have already done tremendous work to compile resource lists where you can find, like, where do I read more, or where do I donate, or what artists should I follow or support right now. All of those things. I mean, I think this is one of those moments. And of course, you know, if you are able to join a protest or call senators and Congress people, even though it feels like they're not listening, numbers matter, right? Any way that you can be active. And I think for theater artists, I mean, my feeling has been the power that we have as theater artists and cultural workers is simply access to a microphone, right? How can we amplify Palestinian voices? How can we even just say the word Palestine every time we get a microphone or a live stream or a platform, right? How are we encouraging people to not be afraid to have the conversation, to ask questions, to engage in dialogue, to do their research, and to take action? And I think that we shouldn't waste time feeling guilty about what we're not doing or haven't done. You know, one of those good Southern expressions that I learned from alternate roots is, you know, guilt is like a rocking chair. It'll keep you busy for a little while, but it don't get you nowhere. And this is one of those times we can't waste time feeling guilty about when we joined the struggle or decided to support. Just get in there and lend your voice in whatever way you can.
Thank you. I was really excited that Rua Roman, who is our Georgia's senator representative, who is Palestinian and a part of the uncommitted movement,
Yes.
was on Democracy Now! Today. So
Yes.
I had her talking about the speech that she would have given if they had allowed her to at the DNC this week. And they're still waiting for an answer on that. So it was exciting to hear that just before we got on our call today. And I encourage folks to go and listen to that snippet of Democracy Now! Andrea, I just think you're the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Oh, virtual hug, Shannon.
Thank you so much for your time today. I know you are a busy, busy, busy person, and I'm glad that we were able to talk about all of the amazing things you got going on. I'm going to definitely drop in a ton of links to the chat on YouTube, and I can't wait to see what comes next. And
Thank you so much for having me. That hour went fast. It's always a joy to talk to you.
Oh, thank you. All right, we'll see everybody else on the next interwebs. Take care.